Good afternoon here in Louisville and online. My name is David Buckley, and I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion here in the Department of Political Science at the University of Louisville. I also am the director of the Center for Asian Democracy here, a center that is dedicated to research, teaching, and in public engagement related to questions of democracy across Asia. For updates on future CAD events, check out our website through the University of Louisville, as well as social media feeds through Facebook, Twitter, etc. We have a talk just next Friday, which I'll say a little bit about at the end, focused on China and U.S. foreign policy as well. Today, we are very glad to be able to facilitate this hybrid event focused on democracy and urbanization in India. I'm especially looking forward to our discussion today because it highlights two of the real crucial both cases and themes shaping democracy across Asia. India is the world's largest democracy. It's one facing real challenges to the future of its democratic institutions. But I think that while some of those challenges are well documented, there's less attention paid to the forces of urbanization and how they might be impacting those democratic institutions. And so that's really what we're going to put on the table today. Urbanization is a huge pattern across Asia, obviously, from parts of East Asia, including China, to South Asia in India, as we'll hear about today. In Southeast Asia and places like the Philippines, urban megacities are transforming daily life, they're transforming economics, and they're also changing politics. So that's what we will hear a little bit about today with Professor Tariq Thachil. Before turning things over to Tariq, I want to acknowledge my colleague at CAD, Ishani Dasgupta. Dr. Dasgupta is our postdoctoral fellow. It's been a pleasure to have her here this year, sharing her work and teaching related to migration and politics in South Asia. And she was instrumental in making today's talk happen. And so we've been so grateful to have your presence this year, Ishani. Just so that the audience knows, both in the room and online, there will be a talk. And then there will be a time for Q&A, and so you can use the chat for that if you're online, and we'll keep an eye on that at the end and bring some of those questions to the room. So without any further ado, Tariq Thachil is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on political parties and political behavior, identity politics, urbanization and migration, and his particular focus on Indian politics. His current work, which we're going to hear about today, focuses on the political consequences of urbanization, drawing on extensive quantitative and qualitative research among poor migrants in Indian cities. The centerpiece of this work is a book recently available in print, co-authored with Adam Auerbach, entitled Migrants and Machine Politics, which has been published by Princeton University Press in print and electronic editions. His first book, Elite Parties, Poor Voters, examines how elite parties use social services to win mass support through a study of Hindu nationalism in India, one of the main topics in Indian democracy today. It was published by Cambridge University Press and won multiple awards from the American Political Science Association for the best book in the entire discipline of political science, focused especially on political parties and comparative politics. His work has appeared in journals like the American Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, and other leading journals of the field. So we are so grateful that especially the morning after some pretty serious storms impacted air travel between here and the East Coast, Tariq was able to make the trip safely, and really look forward to hearing about his project. So welcome, Professor Tariq Thachil.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you especially to Ishani for facilitating. Thank you all of you for showing up. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about local democracy in India during India's urbanization. So I'm going to talk, as David said, a little bit about research that I've been doing for the past decade, looking at questions of how is India's politics and democracy changing as the country increasingly urbanizes. And a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on, sometimes I'm sure you've had talks that look at kind of politics across the world at a very global 30,000-foot level. Today I'm going to take you to give you a kind of worm's eye view of what's been happening in some Indian cities and how local politics is actually transforming as the country urbanizes. And so the title of the book, Migrants and Machine Politics, migrants, I'm sure I'll explain what both of those terms mean in a minute, but this is the book that recently came out, and it's co-written with my colleague Adam Auerbach, who teaches at American University in DC. And Adam and I started talking about this book in 2013, the ideas behind this book in 2013. So since in the time that we've been working on this topic. I lost whatever hair was remaining on my head. Adam had a little baby boy who's now a toddler. And so that's about as long as academic projects take to actually reach printed stage. But let me just tell you like why we got talking about this a little bit. So what were we kind of interested in? Really, as David mentioned, we were motivated by the significant urbanization that's happening across much of the global south. So global south referring to roughly Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, and most of Asia. And what we were kind of interested in was that this is happening in multiple parts of the world simultaneously. So in Western Africa, there are 100 million more urban residents than they were just in 1990. In China, as many of you may know, the urban population went from just 17% in 1978 to crossing more than 50% by 2017, so more than tripling over the course of 4 decades. And interestingly, if we look across the world's future population projections, so where are people in the world going to be added? Almost all of them are going to be added to cities. So over the next 30 years, about 2 billion people are going to be added to the world's cities. And actually, the world's villages are going to lose about 500 million people. And so not only is the world's kind of countryside depopulating, but almost all future population growth is going to happen in cities. And 90% of that is going to happen in just 2 continents, Asia and Africa. So if we think about just that fact, where is the world actually changing? Most of it is in cities of Asia and Africa. And India itself, the country that I study, is at the heart of this kind of profound demographic shift. So the first decade of the 21st century was also the first in which India added more people to its cities than to its countryside. When India gained independence in 1947, it was a predominantly rural country. It is still a majority rural country. And so, unlike many Western democracies, India was actually a case where universal adult franchise, the right to vote for everyone, came while the country lived predominantly in its villages. That is, urbanization is happening after democratization. And if we look at what's going to happen in the future, India is projected to add over 400 million people, roughly the population of the US and France, to its cities by 2050, more than any other country. In fact, it's about equal to number 2 and number 3 combined, which is China and Nigeria. So this is a question that is going to be really important for people who, like me, who look at India to try and understand how is politics going to change as the country urbanizes and adds so many people to its cities. And if we look back when scholars have thought about this in political science, there's actually been heated debates about what is going to happen when countries urbanize. Some people have said that it's actually going to activate ethnic conflict, while others have said that actually urbanization and moving people to cities is going to diminish it. It's actually going to make people less likely to act on and along their ethnic identities, things like race, religion, and caste. Others have said that when countries urbanize, it's going to enable class-based political mobilization, that actually when people move to cities, that's where we get people actually forming class-based coalitions and actually mobilizing, or going all the way back to Marx. Others have said that actually what urbanization is going to do is enhance identification with the nation state. So people are actually going to become more likely to identify with their country rather than their local region as they move from village to city. Almost all of these debates, though, what is urbanization going to do? What is going to be the impact on politics? What is it going to make people care about? Have revolved around the fate of recent arrivals to the city. So we're sitting in a country right now where a lot of these debates took place really around thinking about immigrants coming from other countries to the US during the Gilded Age in many decades ago. And the idea being, okay, so what's going to happen when we have all these transplants from other countries coming into US cities? What is going to actually happen to their politics? How are they going to be incorporated into these cities, into city politics? Well, we have an analog of that debate happening right now in the global south, but instead of thinking of immigrants coming from other countries, most of the debates have been around migrants from the countryside coming into cities, because those numbers way outnumber transnational immigrants. And indeed, across the world, internal migrants, people who move within national boundaries, outnumber transnational immigrants, people who cross nation-state boundaries, by a ratio of nearly 3 to 1. So when we think about migration, actually most of the world's migration is happening within country borders, not across them. And so what is that going to do in the context that we're interested in? And internal migration from village to city is a really important part of thinking about this. But when we started thinking about how this might manifest in India, we realized that scholarship that's looking at how urbanization happened in the West may be of limited value. And part of that is, in many of those contexts, say for example in Western Europe, urbanization entailed a shift from farm to factory, people moving from farms to manufacturing and factory floors. Migrants in the global south in contexts like India aren't really moving in the same conditions. They often move to cities to work and live informally. They don't have formal sector jobs. They don't have salaried employment. They're often working without contracts, and they often live in informal conditions. They don't have formal housing. They often live very informally, and in fact are often settling in what we call informal squatter settlements, popularly known as slums. Across the world now, by most estimates, there are at least 1 billion people residing in slum settlements. And in India, about 65 to 100 million Indians, and that's probably, even 100 million is probably a conservative estimate, reside in slum settlements. And so the question is, what's happening to all of these people? They're moving to cities, they're living in these informal squatter settlements, and how are they getting incorporated into the politics of these growing cities? Are they just being completely excluded? Are they being integrated? Most of the focus so far has been on how are they being included economically? What kinds of jobs are they doing? Do they have any prospects for economic mobility? But we as political scientists think it's equally important to think of how are they being politically included. And for the most part, when people have talked about the politics of slum residents, they've said these are people who are deprived, these are people who are dispossessed, and often coerced. They're often under the thumbs of local dons, mafia bosses, strongmen. That's the image that most people have of slum residents, either completely alienated or excluded from city politics or under the thumb of some local strongman. But most of this kind of discussion happens with very strikingly little engagement of the settlements themselves, talking to people within the settlements, studying people in those settlements, and seeing what does their political lives look like. And that's what we're trying to do in this book. And in the book, we actually argue that once we did that over the past several years, a very different picture emerged than the one we went into. So far from finding that slum residents were completely alienated, passive, without any kind of political agency, we actually found people who were intensely active citizens and actually did a lot of work to construct political networks that connected them to the very heart of city governments and city politics. And kind of remarkably for us, these migrants who are first-generation migrants, often extremely low income, have very lack economic clout, political standing, any kind of connections. They actually actively build and shape the political networks and wield them to demand stuff from the state. They actually build the networks that connect them to the state and use those networks to demand some degree of accountability. So in many ways, they are kind of the heart, the beating heart of local democracy in Indian cities, and often manage to get things from a state that doesn't really want to pay them very much attention. And so then the question became, okay, what are the kinds of political networks that these poor migrants are constructing? How do they actually do that? And this is where that's the title of the book, Political Party Machines, Machine Politics, comes in. Party machines, I'll just quickly tell you what do we mean by that. I won't spend too much time on this, but I just want to have a sense of what does it mean to say a party machine. There's a long history of studying machines, actually, including in this country. You think about the Democratic Party machine in New York and Chicago. You think about the Republican Party machine in Philadelphia, where I'm from. A lot of that terminology actually came from the US, but has now become broadly applied to other parts of the world. So what are machines? Well, machines are political organizations that what they do is they try and win political support, not based on their policy appeals. Here's what I'm going to do, and here's the big policy I have if I kind of come into office. But instead, they target distribution of material benefits for support. So they say, the way that I'm going to win support is actually to give you something in return for your vote. And that something could range from an individual benefit, something like a public sector job, an electric connection, a hospital bed, all the way up to things like paved roads or storm drains, still very local goods. And the idea is that I'm going to give you that thing in return for you giving me your vote. Those of you who've heard of terms like Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed of New York, I don't know if any of you have heard of these figures, then they were the kind of heart of machine politics here in the US. And often these bosses are sitting atop these hierarchical structures. This is another feature of what we think of as machine politics. These kind of vertical networks where you have the boss or patron at the top, having local intermediaries that they work through, often called brokers, and they help what are called the machine's clients, literally the word client, meaning they are the people who receive a service from the party, this benefit, and are seen to have to respond with their vote. So they get the benefit from the machine, give the vote back. These are these little hierarchical networks. And across a big city, you may have many of these networks across the city, different localities having their own local bosses, and these hierarchical structures being organized geographically are the third big feature. And a key actor in this are these local brokers who are often the eyes and ears of these bosses, helping decide who should we give this benefit to, who's most likely to take the benefit and give us the vote back. And so there's been a massive literature kind of documenting the presence of these kinds of party organizations, again, as I mentioned, both in New York, Chicago, and Philly, but also examples increasingly from other parts of the world. There's a huge literature documenting similar machines in places like Buenos Aires, the Peronist machine in Buenos Aires, in cities like Accra in Ghana, and even Bombay in India. But one of the things that's come out of that literature is that across more than 100 years of scholarship, the fates of these machines has been very tightly intertwined with migrants. Migrants are often the key constituencies that machines look to gain support. And we might understand why, because the kinds of things that these parties are offering might be very attractive to poor migrant communities who lack economic resources, political standing, social connections in the new cities to which they've moved. So the promise of somebody as a benefactor helping them might be seen as especially valuable. And yet, there's been a striking neglect of how these networks form, the kind of hierarchies that I showed you going from boss down to client. How do those connections actually form when new people come into a city? How do they actually meet and connect with those kinds of bosses? How do middlemen and brokers emerge within poor migrant communities? You have all these tens of millions of residents in India coming into cities. How do they decide who among them is going to become this local leader? How do senior politicians then connect with those local brokers? And how do these networks connecting migrant slums to the heart of urban politics take shape? Like, how does that actually happen is a process that we haven't really looked at. And in some ways, we're very well suited to look at it in India because it's happening right now. Urbanization is happening in real time. So these networks are taking shape as we study them. And so in our book, we actually try and trace how these political networks between migrants and machines form in two Indian cities, Jaipur and Bhopal. I've shown them up here on the map. And the reason we focus on these cities rather than cities like Bombay or Delhi is because they are more representative of what urban India looks like. So mega cities, as David mentioned, are incredibly important. But in India, there are only 3 cities that actually have more than 10 million people. There are 50 cities that, like Jaipur and Bhopal, have over 1 million, between 1 and 5 million people. So a lot of urban India looks like 1 to 5 million people, which, by the way, by US standards is still huge, but by Indian standards is middle. So in these two cities, we try and focus on 2 major political parties, the Indian National Congress, which is India's party of independence and is kind of seen as a kind of centrist force, and the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, which is the current ruling party and emerged out of India's Hindu nationalist movement. And I'm happy to talk about any of those in the Q&A more if you're interested. So what did we do? Well, we actually, for 2 years combined between us, actually just went into lots and lots of slum settlements across Jaipur and Bhopal and just looked at what does politics here look like? Who is actually emerging as a political leader in these settlements? And what are the ways in which they're connecting to mainstream politics? And the first thing that hit us is that nothing that we were witnessing looked like what we expected. So we thought maybe we'd see a lot of slum residents who knew nothing about politics or who had never been contacted by a political representative, who'd basically been excluded. Instead, what we found were intensely political environments where most people were very politically informed, highly politically aware, and the setting was extremely politically competitive. So far from being under the thumb of a single strongman, the slums in India that we were witnessing saw tremendous amounts of political competition at different levels. So we saw lots of these intermediaries, these slum brokers, competing for attention and affection of the residents that lived with them. We saw a lot of these senior politicians, these patrons, competing for the slum leaders that they thought were the most influential. And we saw residents competing for the attention of these local leaders. And so all of this competition that we saw made us think and made us reevaluate, well, in many ways, what's happening here is the political networks we were interested in studying are being formed through this intense competition. So there's a set of interlocking competitive decisions in which migrants, these poor migrants, these intermediaries, and these senior politicians are choosing one another. And in that process of choosing are constructing these political networks. And so in the book, we look at lots of different selection decisions. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. But we begin by looking at when kind of life begins in a slum, residents move in from the countryside, the first thing that kind of happens is that those communities select who are going to be their local leaders. And for the remainder of today, I'm going to talk about that. How does that actually happen? You have all these first-generation migrants coming in. Who becomes a leader within them? Once they do that, these leaders then have to decide, who in the slum am I going to cultivate as my follower? I can't give everything to everyone, so I have to make tough decisions about, am I going to give you that benefit or am I going to give you that benefit? How do they decide? Who do they actually cultivate? And these two decisions together help create the political network within the slum. We then look at, once that's done, and we have lots and lots of these different leaders bubbling up within slums, how do political parties then decide, well, which of these slum leaders am I going to incorporate into my network? Who am I going to kind of pick and pluck for that? And then, how am I as a politician going to decide which of the many demands I'm going to get from those leaders for goods and services, everything from hand pumps, street lights, voter ID cards, which ones am I going to give? And across all of those 4 decisions that are happening constantly over time, those are the decisions that basically connect local citizens to the heart of city politics. So for today, I'm just going to talk about, for the remainder of the time that I have, I'm just going to give you a quick sense of what does this process look like, because that's kind of what kicks off the whole process and where local democracy starts. So when we talk about these brokers, these intermediaries, in many ways, they've been documented, as I said, across the world. There's a large body of scholarship that shows that such actors exist in a lot of different settings, and they go by a lot of different names. So in India, we have various names for these kinds of figures. We've, in different contexts, called them fixers, caste leaders, Naya Netas, or new leaders. In Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, intermediaries often go by names like tribal chiefs, marabouts, community leaders. In Latin America, terms like capituleros or punteros is used depending on the setting. And then in Europe and North America, they often go by the term of party workers or ward bosses. But again, typically, the scholarship has stopped short of just saying, hey, all these actors exist. Here they are. They're very pervasive. They're very important. But how do they get to be who they were? That is relatively rarely explored. So to begin our exploration, we actually did a survey in 2013 when we first started working on this, just to look at asking slum residents, do these people exist? Are there leaders like this in your community? And what we found was, yes, they did. About over 3/4 of slum residents acknowledged that such community leaders existed in their settlement. And they also said they were important. So roughly half of the 2,000 people we surveyed had visited a leader to seek help from them in the last year. Okay, so what is it that they are trying to seek help with? So we asked the 1,500 residents who said they had sought help, what did you seek help for? And it ranged, the kinds of things that slum leaders did for them was raise their demands to politicians, help them with obtaining documents. So this could be everything from a document that helps you establish the right to vote in a city, to a document that helps you access benefits in the city, things like subsidized food grains or a water connection. And then we're going down the list, things like resolving disputes between residents in the slum, all the way up to alerting the media to issues within the slum. But the point is that across all of these, there are a range of activities that these leaders are doing, almost all of which are kind of problem solving for residents. So all these residents come in, they lack connections, they lack resources, and so they often have a host of problems that they need help with solving, and most often they turn to these community leaders as their first port of call for that help. This is a slum community meeting, and this is one of the leaders. And so this was a picture that was taken back in the 1980s in the slum, and this was one of the first big leaders who emerged within that slum. And we started asking the question to residents, how do these leaders emerge? How do some of you become leaders? And one of the things that was very interesting to us was that almost without any kind of exception, interviews really made clear that slum leaders emerge through bottom-up community support. So it's not a question that, if I'm a senior party leader, I can just install my uncle or my cousin into a slum and make them the leader. Instead, what ends up having to happen is that leader emerges organically from within the slum. So for example, one resident we talked to said, these leaders, we chose them so that they can help us. Another said, leaders come because they help poor people who have no one in the government to go to. We have chosen them for this reason. And finally, we have chosen them because they have information and knowledge and perhaps connections. That's why we choose them. And this language of choice, residents choosing, was actually mirrored when we actually asked slum leaders. So we actually did a survey of over 600 slum leaders that I'll talk about in a second. But about half of them we actually interviewed. And we just asked them, just simply, tell us a story of how you became a leader. And then we actually went through and transcribed and coded those interview transcripts and ourselves made a decision. Was this one where the leader came up organically from the bottom up, or did they come in from the top down? And in 4 out of 5 cases, they first had to build a following in the slum, and that's what drew the attention of political parties and said, hey, maybe you want to come into our network. Very rarely was it the reverse sequence, that it was somebody who already had a political connection, and that's what made them locally influential. So, for example, we actually even asked senior party leaders in both Jaipur and Bhopal, hey, can you make someone a leader? And they said, look, someone from the community has to emerge as a strong leader and have a public following. It's in that case that we can then come in and offer him a position in our party. We even explicitly asked, could you ever make an outsider a leader in the slum? And we were told quite categorically, no. An outsider would not have any mahatva or importance within the settlement. A local from the settlement will know each and every local resident who's good, who's bad. That's the only kind of person who can become a leader, not somebody that we pick. And this kind of bottom-up selection, again, not only runs counter to kind of theories of political science, but if you read Indian newspapers and how they depict slums, or if you watch Bollywood films or shows, hit shows on Netflix like Sacred Games that depicts life in the kind of Bombay underworld of slums in India, all of this kind of goes against how slums are depicted, which is, again, that they're kind of ruled by these kind of tough guys at the bottom of the barrel of a gun, lends itself for much better stories than our book. I don't think our book is ever at risk of becoming a Bollywood epic. But the reality is that this is the conventional idea of how slum politics works, that there are these kind of poor people who are either taken advantage of or don't know any better, and therefore can kind of be the tools for subverting Indian democracy, that these kind of strongmen can use them, buy their votes cheaply, coerce them into voting for them, and by doing so subvert Indian democracy from the bottom up. But that's not really what we were finding. And this kind of aligns with this long-standing view of these brokers as these shadowy, corrupt middlemen. This is actually a cartoon in Harper's Magazine about Boss Tweed, one of these kind of boss-like figures in the US. And this is a figure, more recently thinking of you, David, from the Philippines, of a kind of broker who buys votes of clients, gives them money in order for the vote. And they're kind of generally depicted as these coercive figures. But in sharp contrast, we're finding brokers in Indian slums to be selected by their residents. And this is also enabled by the fact that there's a lot of competition. So we found and documented over 1,000 such leaders in the 110 slums that we surveyed. So that's almost 10 per slum. Only 3 slums did we find where there was no acknowledged leadership. So if there's that much competition, then that allows residents some degree of power and leverage in deciding who they want to seek help from. So then our question is, how do they select? How do they decide who to seek help from? And one of the things we found was that in many slums, there are actually discrete moments, i.e. there are actually situations where the community comes together to select in a formal way who's going to represent them. So these could be community meetings, known as Baiठaks, or even informal elections. We actually found nearly 40% of respondents saying that we actually sit down and have a deliberation over who is going to be our leader. And we actually personally witnessed one of these in a slum in Jaipur, which was facing eviction. So the slum was worried that it was actually going to be bulldozed overnight and everybody was going to be removed from the slum. Because again, slums are settled in places informally. They don't actually have property rights to the place that they're living in. And so eviction is a constant threat. And so facing eviction, the residents of the slum, sorry, this figure has come across quite dark on the screen, but I'll explain to you what it is in a second. They decided they needed a strong leader to help them fight eviction. So how did they decide who that leader was going to be? They actually held an election. And in those elections, paper ballots were held out, were dispensed to residents to make their choice. And they actually called in the local police to oversee the counting of the results, like mimicking a formal Indian election, where the result would be stamped. And this picture, if you could see it, is actually the swearing-in ceremony of the winning candidate and the cabinet that he picked to lead his efforts. And we actually found these handwritten notes that were the rules for the election that included who could stand for the election, and the candidates had to be from the slum. If they were found guilty of any wrongdoing, they could be, an immediate meeting of the slum could be called and they could be removed. So very far from this idea of a dawn, this is an idea of a recall. And that canvassing for the election had to stop 24 hours before election day, again, mirroring Indian formal election rules. So in this particular election, 3 candidates came forward. Jagdish defeated Prem, and actually the third candidate was removed by the people the night before the election because of public drunkenness. And so I think all of that kind of adds up to a picture that looks far different than the one that we initially thought. In addition to these kind of formal elections, a lot of residents also just make more fluid choices in whom to seek help from. So sometimes they may seek help from one leader, and if they're not turning out so good, they may switch their affections to another one, a kind of voting with their feet. But no matter which way they do it, in a formal or informal way, the question then becomes, how does a broker, how does an emerging leader actually get support? How does he attract support from someone? And what we found repeatedly was they had to be able to signal to residents that they were the most likely person to get things done. So, the moment we started shifting our attention from, okay, so leaders come up from the bottom up, they get selected by residents, how? What is the thing that attracts residents to them? The thing that we got told the most often when we were sharing these ideas in India was they're just going to vote for or support whoever's from their social community. So whoever's from their caste or whoever's from their religion, they're just going to line up behind that person. And we were like, okay, maybe, but let's see. Because again, when we were doing our interviews, that wasn't what we were hearing from residents. What residents were telling us is, we want to know who's actually going to get us stuff, who's going to be the most effective in actually getting our demands met. So that's the thing that we became concerned with, is trying to identify who are the kinds of brokers that residents prefer. And that's what I'll end on here. So we did another massive survey of slum residents. And I thought I'd just take a second to tell you, this is not necessarily easy to do. One of the reasons we don't have a lot of data coming from slums anywhere in the world is they're very hard to study. And one of the reasons they're hard to study is that there's no formal list of all the slums in a city. And it's very hard to know where are the boundaries of these settlements. So we actually combined satellite images and municipal lists to identify slums across both cities, and there were over 400 across the two of them. And so we looked at all 400, and then we sampled about 110 from these 400. And within each, we looked at, so just to give you a sense of what these slums look like, sorry these images are coming out so dark, but I don't know if you guys can see, this is one part of one of our cities in Bhopal. And just in this one part of the city, which is actually in the center of the city, you can see slums kind of outlined here. Each one of these is a slum. And you can see that some of them are quite large, like that one up there. Some of them are tiny. Oh, thank you so much. So you can see this over here. So you can see how a couple of features, one, slums vary hugely in size, but also they're spread through the city. So in India, our slums, or most often in cities, are through the city, including the city core. So this contrasts with places like in South Africa, where the slums actually dot the periphery of cities, where the city core is usually slum-free, and that obviously has to do with the legacy of apartheid. But in India, actually, that's not the case. The slum settlements are kind of through the city, and I'm happy to talk about why that happens if you guys are curious. But once we then identified those slums, we had to go within them. And so what we would actually do is take a picture of a slum like this, and then drop points randomly on the map to sample households. And then enumerators would use handheld GPS devices to be able to find that point and interview the household at that point. So actually doing like a representative random sample survey in a space like this is quite challenging. So just to give you a sense of how we actually did that. And then one of the things we did, and I'll just show you the results for this very quickly. I don't want to take too much time on the setup. But basically, we asked respondents, okay, we gave them a hypothetical situation. And we said, okay, let's say that there are these two leaders running for election in your slum. For the position of a local community leader. Who would you pick? And we made them choose between, this was a hypothetical exercise, these two fictitious candidates. And so we just asked them, who would you pick? And we basically, what we were able to do in this exercise was randomize, basically do an experiment where we randomized information about each of those leaders. So in some cases, we randomized whether that leader came from the same caste or jati, faith or religion, or region of origin as the respondents. So in some cases, respondents were seeing leaders who came from the same community as them. In other cases, they did not. We also could randomize the party that that leader was affiliated with. You remember I told you about these two parties, or whether they were just independent. And then we also randomized their education level and their occupation. Let me just give you a quick insight as to why that was the case. So first, we randomized the amount of education that each leader had, whether they were highly educated, like they had a college BA, which about 10% of residents in our sample did, or they had like no education, which about a third of our sample of slum residents had no education. And why we did this was, we were thinking, well, what would make someone seem likely to get stuff done? And one of the things we noticed is getting stuff done requires writing. Almost every kind of service that needs to be obtained, you have to write a petition for it or write an application for it. So we wondered whether slum residents actually preferred educated leaders. Rather than simply thinking about who's from my community, maybe they cared a lot about whether someone was educated. And again, this came from our interviews where somebody, a leader told us, look, the way I built support was residents needed help with everything that needed literacy, filling up forms for ID cards, petitions, and I helped them. And he used a Hindi saying, which is, in a blind world, the one-eyed man is king. So the fact that I had some education made me able to write these petitions. This is a petition he wrote on behalf of residents and get things done for them. And then finally, we varied a broker's job. Again, drawing on fieldwork, because some jobs, all slum residents have difficult jobs. Nobody there is in a high-paying job. But some of these jobs seem more politically connected than others. And we wondered if residents actually cared about that. So for example, there's some jobs that don't really have any political connection. The person just works inside the slum. So people who work and run shops in the slum, for example, they don't even leave the slum during the day. Then there are people who have to leave the slum for their work. So we thought maybe that puts them in contact with people outside of the slum. And then there are people who leave the slum to actually specifically work for government offices. And we wondered if these people might be seen as very attractive leaders because they have those government connections, even though the jobs that they're working are very humble, as sweepers, clerks, and security guards. And again, we got this insight from a resident who said, look, even if a man is just a security guard at a government office, maybe he's more likely to get things done because his bosses will be people who know how to get things done in the city. So let me just show you the results. I'm not going to go through all the stats and stuff. I just wanted you to have an intuition of what we found, who gets preferred. And what we found is at the top, these items up here are those community variables. So basically what this is showing in these dots, and I can go into that if there's interest, but basically what this is showing is that yes, residents on average prefer candidates who are from their caste community, candidates who are from their faith. But strikingly, much more important is actually education. So the single most important determinant of who gets preferred in these settlements is education. So this is comparing someone who has college education to someone who has none. And what we found is this difference was the biggest that we found across our whole experiment. And I'm happy to talk about some of the other results, but for us, just that fact alone was striking, that not only are residents selecting their leaders against this grain of popular narratives, but when they select them, they actually privilege how educated they are, much more than just whether they're from their same caste. And again, that goes against a lot of conventional understandings of these people. So in some ways, this seems like a very heartfelt and kind of optimistic story about local democracy in India. But one question might be, should we even believe these results, right? We've asked people this in a hypothetical way. Maybe they just made up answers, right? And that's something you always have to worry about. So the way that we looked at this was actually looking at whether these results in any way align with real-world decisions. So we looked at, well, how could we check if they're just telling us a story that sounds good or telling us something real? So to do this, we actually said we've got to see who the actual leaders in each of these settlements are, and do they actually have the qualities that residents said they wanted. And so we did this survey of slum leaders across the same settlements in which we interviewed residents. And to do this, how do you find slum leaders? Well, this is another challenge. There's no big list or no telephone directory or yellow pages for, oh God, people don't even know what yellow pages are anymore. There's no list on Instagram. There's no Instagram story that tells me where slum leaders are. So what we did was we actually asked residents twice in 2 different waves of surveys, who are the leaders in your settlement? And we had a cutoff rule. It had to be more than one person. So I couldn't say, hey, I'm a big leader or my cousin is a big leader. But basically, everybody after that, we then went to political parties and had them vet and say, hey, are these people that you've heard of? Are these people that you know in any way? And we included all confirmed party workers who lived in a settlement. And this process led us to about 900 leaders across these 110 slums, and we were able to actually interview over 2/3 of them. And so this was the first survey that I'm aware of these figures in India. And so what we looked at was that we looked at who are these people who are coming up, these actual leaders, who are they? And the thing that we found is, firstly, quite strikingly, they're very diverse. So it's not that we found that whatever the biggest caste group in a particular settlement was, the leader just came from that caste group. Instead, we found over 160 different caste groups that leaders came from, and they came from every major Indian faith, Hinduism, Islam, even Christianity. They also came from a lot of different regions from across India. Interestingly, we found that while they're predominantly male, about 12% of slum leaders were women. Why I think this is interesting is because in formal Indian politics, really the only time we get women in politics, in formal office, is when there's a gender-based quota for them. Here, there are no quotas. These are informal positions. So the 12% of women who are coming into these positions, they're real leaders. They're not there because of a quota, which is often where women run as proxies for their husband just to fulfill the quota. So these are actual leaders who are coming up, which I thought was interesting. And almost all of them are political actors, are affiliated with a major political party. And strikingly, about 2/3 of them have formal positions within political parties. And what we found was, so just I told you about education was this #1 trait that residents said they liked. Well, that accords with who they actually select. So they're putting their money where their mouth is. We see these are slum leaders in green and slum residents in blue. And you can see while there are almost 40% of residents are uneducated, very few slum leaders are. On the other side, when you see how many have high school or college education, the green bars are much higher than the blue bars. So slum leaders on average are much more educated than residents. They also tend to be in higher performing jobs. Let me conclude with just one other thing that I just thought was kind of interesting. This is kind of after we'd done the research for the book, but one of the things that kind of happened was we wanted to know, does education even matter? And so the COVID lockdown actually gave us this unique moment to see how effective are these slum leaders. Because in India, there was a very stringent national lockdown that was, as soon as COVID came up in April and May of 2020, the whole country went through a massive lockdown, far more stringent than anything we experienced in the US. And there was a major concern that slums would be the hotbeds of COVID because everybody's living in these cramped conditions, that they would be the epicenters of where the COVID pandemic would spread. And people were really worried about what was happening in slums, but no one was going into slums because people were scared to go in there. And we had all these slum leaders we had interviewed, and we had their phone numbers. So we said, let's just call them and see what's going on. And one of the things we did on that survey, we were able to access about half of our slum leaders, was we asked them, hey, are you aware of all the emergency relief schemes that the the Indian government has for you right now? And we asked them to name the schemes. And this is like how many could name them correctly. 0 correctly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 correctly. And what we found was the people who were getting most of them correct were actually the ones who were more educated. So it makes sense that residents actually use education as a kind of proxy for who's going to be a good leader, because this random test that COVID provided showed evidence that actually the more educated leaders did know more about what was available to residents and could help them better. Okay, I'm going to end on that. Let me just say just a couple of things in concluding before throwing it open. In some ways, this is like a part of the book that gives you this kind of worm's eye view of Indian politics during urbanization. And I think it reveals a very different politics than we often assume when we just look at things from the top down. India, when we look at these migrants that I've been studying as political actors, far from being passive, they're highly active citizens whose actions strongly depart from stereotype. They're not passive, they're not simply coerced. They actually care about the competence of people, not just the community that they come from. But it's also important to note some limits to our argument, both in terms of what this model can deliver and in terms of its significance. So in terms of what the model can deliver, one of the sobering things that I've wrestled with is, on the one hand, this sounds great. There's a lot of democracy, there's a lot of competition, and these leaders are getting selected because they serve their people. On the other hand, the thing that slum residents want the most in the world, which is a property right to their home, almost none of them have been able to get. So this model seems to work well in delivering benefits like water connections or voter ID cards, but there seems to be a real ceiling on the level of benefit it can deliver, and I'm happy to talk about why that might be the case. The second, and this is something that David alluded to in his intro, is that India is facing, at a kind of national level, real challenges to the overall health of its democracy. And part of that is that democracy is getting more and more centralized in the capital, New Delhi, and in the central government. And that means that the state is kind of moving further and further away from these communities. And so how much this local democracy is going to matter when the overall trend of democracy is getting increasingly centralized is one challenge. And the second is India is becoming much more polarized, often along ethnic lines. And so in some ways, I'm showing you a picture where I'm saying ethnicity and caste and religious division seems to matter less than we thought at the local level. But at the national level, if it starts mattering more and more, is that going to corrode some of what we are documenting in the book? I think that's still an open question. But I'll leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much for that really remarkable presentation. We'll have time for Q&A. Maybe I can just get things started by
Sure.
teeing one question up.
Yeah.
So you've talked about these local political brokers who are trying to build their bases of support in these informal communities. I'm curious, like maybe you could describe for us a little bit more who else is trying to organize in these slums. Are there major business associations? Are there religious associations? Are there soccer clubs? What's the social organization in these communities like outside of politics?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So there are other organizational forms that exist in the settlements. So for example, there are actually, from the outside world, the biggest kind of presence is NGOs. So local community NGOs that are trying to do everything from organizing self-help or microcredit. I don't know if some of you guys have heard of like microcredit groups where small loans are given predominantly to women to help them start local businesses, et cetera. So that's a huge set of actors in slum settlements. In fact, funnily, when we went to do surveys, we had to explain, the biggest thing you have to do in India when you do a survey is say, I'm not from the government, right? Because slum residents will be very nervous that are you coming to kind of figure out who's here so that you can kick them out. That's hard enough. What we weren't planning for was they believed that we weren't from the government, but then they were convinced that we were from some NGO who was trying to give them some benefit or give them a loan. And we had to disappoint them by saying, we can't give you anything other than just wanting to hear your opinions. But that gave us a sense of how often they'd actually been surveyed by non-governmental actors. So there is an effort. But the organizing there is usually around some kind of like localized self-help group. Politically, there's almost no effort. So for example, unions have almost no presence there. And that's often to do with the fact that the work that they do is highly informal on daily contracts. They have no contracts, so it's not like I'm assured work for a month or 2 months. And so there's almost no presence of kind of labor-based organizing in the slums we worked in. And this could be different in other cities. So it's mostly this kind of NGO self-help world. And then to some degree, religious organizations are the other ones. So religious welfare organizations do have a presence in the slum. And they are they are a little bit more of the only for their community. They kind of do services only for their community. So these figures that we're working are a little bit different because they kind of cross religious divides a little bit in terms of who they work for. And they're very tightly connected to parties. So that's the main organizing politically in the slum. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Anyone in the room? And also, if you're online, we will be looking at the chat in just a second, so feel free to chat in any questions.
Thanks a lot, Tariq.
Yeah.
That was a really remarkable presentation, as echoing David's work. I had a couple of questions. I wanted to ask, how is the politics of a space like this, like Jaipur and Bhopal, different from, say, Bombay and Delhi? And particularly, what is how many evictions do these tenants face?
Yeah.
And like, especially when you think about something like Delhi, where they're, being evicted to the periphery.
Yeah.
So how does that look?
Yeah, so absolutely. So one question is like, what's different if we go to, say, bigger cities? Like I talked about actually deliberately not going into Bombay and Delhi. What would happen if I went there? So I think a couple of things. One is almost all popular understandings of slums in India actually does come from Bombay and actually comes from one particular slum in Bombay called Dharavi that some of you, if you guys have seen Slumdog Millionaire or heard of that movie, a lot of the kind of imagination of slums in India comes from that. And that's often very common. Even in other countries, there's like one mega slum. So Dharavi is a slum that has tens of thousands of people that inform our opinion. That is a very exceptional slum though. Most slums in India are not tens of thousands of people and decades old. So if we looked at Bombay and Delhi and older cities, bigger cities, they tend to have older slums. So one of the things that we looked at is the average slum in our sample is only about 20 years old, which means that they've just been settled and the first generation of settlers are still living there. In some of these bigger cities, those slums have been through multi-generational processes, and so they do look a little bit different. They are in some ways better organized, but they're also in these big cities where the value of land is so extreme, the prices of land are so extreme, that they have a much more uphill battle to fight in resisting eviction. That's still happening in smaller cities in India now too. One of the things that happens with urbanization is more and more people are moving to cities, the value of land is going up. So slum leaders are having to fight a fight to resist eviction because developers want to come in, take that land, buy it, and then flip it for property. And so even in our sample, we do see eviction. So 110 slums that we surveyed, by now 2 have been evicted. It's not a very rapid pace of eviction, so I think if we did this in Delhi and Bombay, we would have more, especially in Delhi, getting evicted. But I think in the most cities in India, eviction is less likely. What is more likely is that these slums just exist in kind of a purgatory, where they're allowed to be there, but they're never fully secure. So we asked, why can you not get the property title? And they were like, that's the one thing that parties will not be able to deliver for us. And there are various reasons for that, but part of it is it creates political dependence. As long as they don't have that title, they are going to be dependent on politicians for their favor. And so the strategies that slum residents have used to resist eviction, including selecting leaders, is actually building. So they feel that if we build up our properties, it's almost like a defensive, it gives us more proof that we're here. Like if we build, one person told me, each story of my house, each floor is a decade. So if I have 3 stories, it shows that I've been here for 30 years. And of course, there's no such rule, but they feel like that's what it projects. So you see a lot of construction in slums. And in fact, one of the interesting things that's done is it's created a vibrant rental market, because often they build stories that they don't necessarily need, and then they rent it out. And so there's this whole economy on showing that we're here and we matter. How effective that will prove in the future, I think, is to be determined. I think we're still in early days with these slums. Yeah.
Thank you for your insightful remarks on India. And you talk about China's migrant situation as well, right? I noted there are some similarities and there's maybe some differences between the Indian migrants and the Chinese migrants.
Yes.
The first similarity is that, there is massive migration towards big cities.
Yeah.
Actually, in the case of China, people are talking about in the future, maybe 25% of the Chinese population will be living in 4 urban centers.
Interesting.
That was Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenzhen.
Yeah.
Basically, massive concentration. Like Japan too, right? Like Japan too. Second similarity is that those migrants who migrate into big cities, the situation is very different from the urbanization in Europe, in the sense they are all living in a sort of informal situation.
Yes.
Which the more common word is a bad situation, actually. In the case of China, the 20 people live in the same room. Both sexes, it's just a mess, right? And also the jobs are pretty bad.
Yes.
For instance, in the case of Beijing, hotel workers, restaurant workers, taxi drivers predominantly are migrants. So I think I noted this is probably similarities. But a little difference is that you concentrate on the political atmosphere, a political dimension of this whole thing, right? In the case of China, they focus on the socio-economics because political mobilization is not encouraged. It's sort of oppressed. One big issue is the school children. The migrants, they want their children to go to local schools. In Beijing, it's very, very difficult to get into good schools in Beijing. So these migrant workers from the remote areas, they love to have their children to have the good education in Beijing. So my question is that, what about the situation in India on this? Thank you.
So I'll say, thank you for the question. So I think that, one interesting phenomenon in India is that we have yet to see whether urbanization is going to super concentrate in 3 or 4 cities like that. So interestingly, actually, some work I'm doing now is on small towns in India, towns that have less than 100,000 people. India has 7,933 towns. About 95% of them have less than 100,000 people. So right now we have a lot of dispersion. We still have a lot of people living in these big cities, but one of the things to see is it going to get concentrated? But right now, a lot of urbanization is in fact in even smaller towns than the ones we study, just as a point of note that's kind of interesting. But the question about, how is our economic inclusion and how are slum residents kind of mobilizing on that? I think one of the reasons we focus on politics is that is the way that they are trying to mobilize even on for kind of economic welfare. So in India, the big difference, I think, with China is that slum residents understand the biggest thing that they have is votes. Because they are so densely populated, and because slums are so dense, they are dense. In India, they call vote banks, literally banks of votes. And they actually, it was really interesting for me, an average slum resident has often been able to tell me, my slum is 5,000 people. In the last election in this constituency, the vote margin between the number 1 and number 2 candidate was 3,800. So our slum can tip the ballot, like they know this. Like, I'm not talking about the leaders, I'm talking about the residents know this. And so they see, and one of the amazing things that we actually document is, unlike middle classes or wealthy classes in Indian cities who vote at about a 50 to 60% rate, in slums, turnout in election is 85 to 90%. So everybody votes. And they know that that's the way that they're going to create their political leverage. And so even the demands that they've made, and it's not been so much for schools and healthcare, and I think that's kind of interesting. That's its own question in India. Why is it schools and health are very rarely electorally very salient? It's been much more public goods like roads, sewers, household water tap connections. Those have been the big demands. But they do that through politics. And so for them, politics is the kind of route into those economic demand making. And I think that's a kind of maybe an interesting distinction with the Chinese case, but maybe it's different routes to often the same demands or often the same concerns. And I think in some ways their positions are so precarious, from what I've read, even more precarious than in some cases the Chinese cases, that their demands haven't even got up to levels of schooling for my kids. The second thing I'll say is that we have some studies from bigger cities of are people who come to slums able to move out. It's a little bit empirically difficult to study, but so far we have evidence that social mobility in India's slums is very low. So a lot of migrants think the slum is going to be the launching point into the city, that one generation will be in the slum and then they'll move out. But from Bangalore and Bombay, where we have these older slums, we see that very rarely happens. And even more troublingly, the kids of first-generation migrants are often more educated than their parents, but the quality of job has not improved. So I think that speaks to India's larger challenges with job creation. We have a very big labor market problem where we're not actually, the supply of good jobs is not keeping up with the population growth. So I think the slums are reflective of that. Yeah? Oh, sorry.
About how the slums are distributed throughout the city earlier, like in comparison to South Africa.
Yeah.
So why is that? Like, why are they distributed like that?
Yeah, it's a really, it's an important question. So a couple of reasons. One is, how does a slum become a slum? And so typically what it means, the number one thing you need is just available land. Some land is lying vacant. Now in India, given its population, there's always a reason that land is vacant. It's never just vacant because nobody was like, I don't know what to do with this. There's always pressure on the land. So most often that land either belongs to the government and hasn't been allocated for something, or it belongs to someone privately, but there's a dispute over who owns the land between two private parties. So then there's a kind of stay on whether you can construct legally on that land. So slum residents take that as an opportunity. They see the land lying vacant and they start squatting on it. And then once they start squatting on it, often they tell people from their village or in their community, hey, there's land available here. And very quickly it occupies that built space. So the spaces I showed you here, the reason those are the boundaries is like that's the natural edge. Either you hit a road or a natural barrier, that's the land that was available. And sometimes that's a big amount of land and sometimes it's a small amount of land. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that all that available land is kind of built up. Now they're starting to build on the periphery. But the reason that they often prioritize land in the city, and this has to do with the nature of work in India, is that poor people in the city are often working in service of wealthy people. So and that's not only true in India, but one of the reasons is that they will not move. So sometimes they've even been given the opportunity, move outside and we'll give you your own land, but you have to move out. And they say, but all the jobs are here because if I work as a cleaner, the people I need to work for me are wealthy people who all live in the city center. So often the resettlement programs to move people out, we find within a year or two they move back, even if they're getting their own like apartment somewhere else, because they need to be close to the places for work. And so that's why they continue to remain strewn within them. But now, as Ishani was saying, as pressure keeps mounting to have them evicted to develop that land, whether they can hold out and whether Indian cities will keep looking that way, we'll have to see. It's not totally clear, but good question.
One last question.
I was just curious, how long can a slum leader like stay in their position of power?
Yeah, there are no term limits yet. So it could be a while. But one of the interesting things we actually did when we did the phone survey during COVID was track like are some of these leaders now waning, and we started collecting data on them in 2013. So we have seen leaders leave their position in two different ways. One is nobody comes to them anymore. So I actually interviewed someone, and he was complaining, and he was saying he was one of the earliest leaders of the settlement, and he's like, nobody comes to me anymore. It was interesting. It used to be very hard to interview him. Now it's very easy because nobody's coming to him. And so I was like, I asked, I was like, usually your office is full. And he said, what's changed is almost all the welfare schemes in India are now moving to digital platforms, and he doesn't know how to work that, and he doesn't own a smartphone. His nephew does, but he doesn't. And so very interestingly, his nephew has now become a rising leader, but they're not very collaborative. And so, that kind of access. So, we measure education very crudely here, but actually I think digital education is going to become increasingly important because that's where a lot of the benefits are migrating to. So people are moving with that. People quickly find out that, hey, I came to you for help, and it's a bit of a cutthroat world. Like, it's great that you helped me in the past, but if you're not going to be able to help me in the future, I'm going to move. That's one way leaders move. The second way is if they actually get into some kind of trouble. And this was interesting to us. So like a couple of leaders actually tried to become strongmen. They tried to actually start exerting coercion and influence. And actually 2 of them were like formally stripped of their title in the slum because enough residents got upset. Doesn't mean there's not criminality. I don't want to paint, there are some who are criminal, there are some people who are shadowy, but they were the very small minority. And the 2 major ways leaders left was either because they got into some kind of either legal trouble or got stripped of a title, or they just weren't as effective as they used to be.
Great. Well, wonderful discussion. Maybe we can thank Professor Thachil one more time for being with us.
Thank you, guys.
And for everybody in the room as well as online, at CAD, we're always thrilled when we can have these kinds of conversations, but they go better when people join us and ask such wonderful questions. So thanks to you all for being here. We will have another talk next Friday focused on China and U.S. foreign policy, which we're co-sponsoring with the Program in Asian Studies, as well as the Department of Political Science. And so you can check out our website, Facebook, or other social media feeds for information on that talk, as well as once things get processed, the video of this talk to share with friends. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.